Welcome to another edition of the Corner Booth Podcast here from the Snowden Deli. I'm Aaron Rand from CJAD along with Bill Brownstein of the Montreal Gazette. And today our guests include two former federal ministers at the same time. Marc Garneau, David Lametti, thank you both for joining us today. And before we get to talking about everything going on, I want to mention David brought in Marc's book. Marc Garneau has a book. You can... and you brought it in to have it personally signed.
Exactly.
Nice
I've been looking forward to doing that ever since I bought the book. So thank you, Marc.
Thank you, David. My pleasure.
All right. So let's jump right in. First of all, as I said off the top, you're both former federal ministers. Marc in transport and, of course, in foreign affairs. David as justice minister. I guess the first question I have is, having been in this party, what's it been like watching what's happened over the past 2 weeks, starting with Justin Trudeau's resignation? Some people suggest he waited too long. I want to know what you think. Did he wait too long? Is this a good thing, a bad thing? Let's start with you, Marc.
Well, I have to come to the conclusion that he waited too long. I think that he had trouble recognizing that his moment had passed and held on, and unfortunately put himself ahead of both the party and the country.
David?
Well, the same conclusion. I think he waited too long. We all recognize, I think I said it once on this podcast as well, that he had the right to decide. He'd earned that right. But he did wait too long. It's put us in a difficult position. I say us because I'm still hopefully involved with respect to a leadership race. And I do think it's put the party at a disadvantage. And I think ultimately it... I won't say tarnishes, but it will prevent the appreciation in the short term of what I think is a pretty good record on his part. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to underline that. It is a good record, but I think the fact that he's waited so long has everybody talking about the wait and the resignation and the precarious position the party's been left in, as opposed to the record, which if he had left 6 months or a year ago, we would have celebrated the record in a much more profound way.
It's kind of a Bidenesque sort of situation, because what he's done effectively is done what you suggest. Perhaps like his record will get lost in all of this. And secondly, it has really handicapped whoever takes over, because, I mean, in the polls right now, the Liberals are 25% behind Poilievre and the Conservatives. And no matter who comes in, it's going to be daunting in terms of trying to make any kind of inroads.
There's no question it'll be hard, but I don't think it will be impossible. But I
really think that they could overcome this with a new leader?
I do think. Look, I have a horse in the game.
Which horse is that?
Marc Carney has been a friend of mine for over 30 years. We played hockey together at Oxford, and we've been good friends since. And I would visit him in London. I would see him when he came back to Canada, both in Toronto and later in Ottawa. So he's a friend. I'm helping. I do think he'd be an outstanding leader. I think Christie or Karina would also be outstanding leaders too. So I don't think it's too late to turn it around, but it is much more difficult.
And Marc, do you have a horse?
I'm not weighing in at this point, maybe a little bit later on, but I would say that in some ways what's happening now is not unusual. Canadians generally get tired of the party in power after 2 terms, 8 years, 9 years, 10 years. We saw it with Chrétien Martin, we saw it with Harper, we're now seeing it with Justin Trudeau. They feel that after a certain amount of time, it's time to look at a change. So it seems a little bit difficult for some leaders to recognize that and say, I'm going to leave while I can still be remembered primarily for my legacy. And that is unfortunately something that happens to most prime ministers when the time comes to say goodbye. I know that it's time for me to go.
With respect to Bill's question, the idea of, is this going to hurt given the way this all played out? I'm sure both of you probably heard Jean Chrétien last week talking about overcoming what is right now, I think, let's call it a 25% fallback as far as polling is concerned. Is that an insurmountable lead? I know Canadian politics might suggest it's not. Do you think it is, regardless of who ends up leading the party?
Look, I don't think it's insurmountable, but I am realistic about the difficulty of climbing that slope. It is tough. The longer the Prime Minister stayed, the harder it got. And so we need to get a lot of positive messaging out very quickly. We need for people to get to know at least 2, if not 3 candidates very quickly. And we need to get a policy platform out very quickly. So this is it is not impossible, but it is daunting, and it is sad to be in this position. But on the other hand, we just need to roll up our sleeves and do the best we can with.
But even more daunting is what we're facing as of Monday: potential 25% tariffs being imposed on Canadian goods. Marc, your foreign affairs was your bailiwick, that this was your area of expertise. Well, towards the end, this is nuts. How do you see the situation developing?
Well, I always go back to the fact that Trump is a transactional leader. He likes to put you on your back foot when he's negotiating, whether it was real estate in New York or the terms of that he's going to impose on Canada with respect to with tariffs. So there's nothing surprising there. I would encourage Canadians not to hyperventilate, but to be prepared for it. There will be some pain, there's no question about it, with tariffs when they're imposed. But it looks, from what I've seen in the media, that the government is currently preparing its strategy with respect to retaliating. Both a first level of retaliation, depending on what Trump actually does. Is he going to put 25% across the entire board, or will he be more selective? We're not sure yet. But I think there is a plan in place for Canada to retaliate. Anybody who says it's going to be painless is not connected to reality. It will be painless for us, and I think eventually will be painful for the United States as well. And if one looks historically at tariff impositions, and the United States did this in the 20th century to us, ultimately it becomes self-defeating and they disappear. Hopefully that will happen, hopefully quickly, but I think we're going to go through some pain.
So with respect, this is interesting because when you talk about a unified position, you had a big meeting this week with all the premiers save Danielle Smith, and she's also, I guess, the only outlier, although maybe there might be two, because Manitoba perhaps has something at stake here with respect to energy, and Saskatchewan does with respect to energy. Is that a negative for Canada when you have an individual provincial premier speaking out against the national interest and saying, well, look, when it comes to energy, when it comes to oil, we're not on this team? I mean, that's a bit unusual.
That's unusual, and it's sad. We do need, one of the things we did last time, Marc will remember, and we did it well as a government, was the unity, that unified front that we led, and it included opposition leaders, opposition parties, it included provincial governments, territorial governments, and business and industry. And we need to do that again. And to have a premier basically say, no, we're not going to do that, it really weakens that unified approach. And it's what we need. We are all going to suffer if for some reason one province cuts a side deal with the United States. It beggars thy neighbor, right? It beggars everyone else, and it has a negative impact on other provinces. And so we need to pull that together. There was some movement towards unity yesterday. There was some more positive rumblings from Scott Moe and others who were initially much more skeptical. Danielle Smith is still an outlier, but we need to get everybody on the same page in order to go through the pain that Marc rightly points out we will go through.
And I agree with David. I would add one little detail, because I'm old enough to remember that in the 1980s, when Pierre Trudeau brought about the National Energy Program, whereby essentially he said that Alberta should subsidize oil for the rest of the country. That created a rift that still exists today. And I think it's important for Canadians to realize how sensitive Albertans are to this. And yes, we need to be unified. We shouldn't be throwing recriminations against each other in public, that's for sure. But we should try to work inside the tent to find a way that would, if possible, be acceptable even to a province like Alberta. That, I think, ultimately is our aim. We don't want to wash our linen in public, which is happening a little bit at the moment.
What's particularly disturbing is I've never seen this condescension coming from an American president toward Canada, this whole 51st state, the whole governor business, this just complete contempt, it seems, for the country. I mean, I can't recall any U.S. president ever, not understanding that Canada...
Even asked to his point, are you surprised by that from someone like a Donald Trump?
No, I'm not surprised at all.
Really?
And no, I'm not. And let's be very, very clear. Canada is never going to become part of the United States. Why? Because the vast majority of Canadians don't want to be Americans. We like our neighbor, we get along with them fine, but we do not want to become Americans. It's never going to happen. But is it surprising that Trump is doing this? Not at all. That's how he likes to do things. Conquer, divide and conquer if he can. And this is trying to put us again on our back foot. But it is never going to happen. The tariffs, yes, are going to happen, but nobody in his right mind is taking the idea of being annexed by the United States seriously for even 1 second.
You've met Trump?
I have met Trump, yes. I was at the White House when the Prime Minister first met Trump back in 2017 during his first mandate. And there were 20 of us for lunch, and 10 Canadians and 10 Americans, and I sort of watched him in action. He was brand new at the time, and I'll just say what I saw there is what you see is what you get. He doesn't behave differently in a private setting than he does in public.
Wonderful.
There's been the suggestion that given Justin Trudeau's decision to walk, that maybe Canada's at a disadvantage in negotiating with the US now because we have what essentially is a lame duck prime minister. Do you think that's fair criticism, or is this a bigger issue than that?
I think it's a fair concern. I think it's something that can be met both by the Prime Minister in this interim period and by whatever happens next. Whether it's, I think whatever happens next will happen quickly, whether it's a government being installed and remaining or whether there's a general election quickly. It's a temporary situation. I agree that it's not ideal. But we can pull together in the meantime the best we can, and I think we can get to a resolution of that uncertainty quickly.
You mentioned, Marc, a minute ago, and it's interesting when you go back, historically, we've had, even back then, this is almost hard to believe just to say, even opposition parties who would, in a situation like this, get on board because this affects Canada as a country. It's not about a political party. Yet you're seeing exactly the opposite now from someone like a Pierre Poilievre, who continues to go out of his way to say he's over here and the rest of the country is over there. Is that disappointing in a sense? Or we've come to expect that from him. But you think for what potentially is a crisis like we're about to enter into, that might change? It's not happening.
It is very disappointing. One would hope that on an issue of such national urgency as this, that Poilievre would be singing from the same sheet. However, and this is the big question mark that a lot of people have about Poilievre, is he capable of transcending his sort of populist sloganeering approach where he just attacks, and is he able to think at a higher level, in this case, national unity, the importance that all of this carries for Canada? So far, he is not demonstrating it. He's still in attack dog mode, and he doesn't seem to make that transition so that people can say, well, maybe he has the royal jelly to be the Prime Minister. He hasn't demonstrated that at all yet.
Other people in his caucus certainly have it. When you do parliamentary work with them, they'll say the minute I cross the border, I'm Team Canada, and we're all one team. When we leave I'll disagree with you here in Parliament, but we cross the border into another country on any kind of parliamentary work, we're all Team Canada. And Aaron O'Toole was fantastic as a leader, and Rona Ambrose before him. When
Harper to an extent.
we I think our party supported Harper when he was traveling internationally and working for Canada internationally. We have to do it. It's a duty to our country.
The Corner Booth podcast is brought to you in part by the Snowden Deli, serving Montrealers since 1946 and home of the city's best smoked meat sandwich, the Snowden Deli, DeCarry Boulevard, north of Queen Mary Road. So I want to turn the clock back a little farther because I think we have to discuss what happened. Chrystia Freeland announced or tweeted today or posted today that she will officially announce, I guess, on the weekend. Marc is in the race. Marc Carney's in the race. But if we go back to a couple of weeks before that Monday bombshell where Chrystia Freeland walked out of that meeting after being told she'd have to present the budget update, and that really, everything changed based on what happened that day. You have both been in the cabinet. You have both left the cabinet. So people bring up the idea that there must be something wrong with the way Justin Trudeau does or doesn't get along with other people. Did you experience? I'm guessing you did. You left and you had issues.
Well, he and I did not. We were not compatible personalities in some ways. I'm 20 years older, more than 20 years older than he is. I'm from a different generation. I approach things a little bit differently. That being said, it's not essential for cabinet ministers to be buddy-buddy with the Prime Minister. We are there to do our job. But based on what I saw reported with respect to Chrystia Freeland's basically torpedo, it was that he had a conversation with her, told her, I want you to put out the economic statement this afternoon, and then I'm going to be replacing you. Now, I don't care whether you're super sensitive or you're not sensitive at all. That is something that I can understand fully, her reaction to that kind of basically, so not even an ultimatum, it's your marching orders.
I think that's right. I think that's right with respect to that Monday morning. It's hard to maintain your credibility if the Prime Minister has basically told you that he has no confidence in your ability moving forward. And so it I think is clear. The choice becomes very clear to you if you're in that position. With respect to styles, I'll echo what Marc said. My management style or my governance style is not like the Prime Minister's. I had a similar experience to what Marc had, which is I wasn't buddy-buddy with the Prime Minister, as you put it. And I realized pretty quickly when I went in that I would be working through my staff. And so most of what I did, virtually all of what I did, with the exception of when I spoke at the cabinet table, was done through staff and to the Prime Minister's
Well,
staff.
both of you were very content in your portfolios, you in foreign affairs, you in justice. This came out of the blue that all of a sudden, like he wasn't interested or whatever, and I found that very disturbing too on another level. Like Chrystia Freeland was a different situation, I think, but both of you were effective in your roles and you were just sort of handled in a very uncavalier fashion, shall I say.
Look, I won't say anything about that. What I will say is there is, I think, a belief, there was a belief, I'm hoping it is a belief that will change, that cabinet ministers are all somehow interchangeable.
Right.
Marc Garneau brings a certain set of skills to the table, whether as Minister of Transport, someone who's been an astronaut, whether as Minister of Foreign Affairs with all the foreign experience that you've had. And that you have to recognize that in the kinds of decisions that you're making. You can't simply shuffle him out without considering what you are losing, right? And so there was a belief, I think, that you could put anybody anywhere, and I don't think that recognizes experience. I don't think that recognizes competence. It's not the only criterion,
Or ethics.
but it has to be the main criterion.
Yeah. But nonetheless, it's just disheartening on a certain level that decisions are made like that without thinking about the skill sets that people can bring to their jobs. And you wonder if that hasn't impacted the Liberals on a bigger scale, and certainly Justin's legacy on a bigger scale.
Yeah, and I'm going to blow David's trumpet here because David is a highly respected legal expert on so many things and was highly respected both within cabinet and in his handling of his portfolio. So one has to wonder, why is there a need to make this change? What happened?
Is it about not towing the company line, as it were, to some degree, to a great degree?
Look, as I haven't spoken about this publicly, as Attorney General or Minister of Justice, there are times when you have to say things that are unpleasant or unpopular. And I honestly don't think it was. I really do think it was the interchangeability, that the government was down in the polls, thought they needed a shake-up.
But why would changing a justice minister make any difference? How's that going to affect your polling? Why would that affect your polling?
Brought in a younger minister.
Yeah, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You know what I know you haven't spoken about this publicly. The whole idea, let's take Quebec, over the language issues here, and over the government choosing not to get involved federally. And I know you had a limit as to what you could say. I'm sure as a Quebecer, you maybe perhaps didn't necessarily agree with the government's position. Do you not think that was an issue for the Prime Minister? I know you can't speak for him, but
I honestly don't know because I haven't spoken about it. To be honest, I haven't spoken to him about it. And there are a lot of things I could speculate as part of it. Sometimes there were difficult conversations at the cabinet table and in cabinet committees. But I honestly, I'm perfectly honest with you, I don't know the reason.
Okay.
Let's look at foreign affairs, where we have a huge weakness. Now we had, why would you? I mean, Marc has experience. He's got wisdom in this area. This comes at a time, well, not just with the States, like with the world. We're sitting, as I've said before, at the children's table when it comes to when you're speaking to, all the foreign powers, and he's replaced by Melody Joly. Not to dismiss her, but the point is she doesn't have that kind of experience at a time when we need somebody who understands the international arena. That I never understood either. And
did you ask for a reason? Did you try to find out
No,
why?
I didn't. And people said to me, well, why didn't you ask? And I didn't feel it was appropriate for me to ask. So to this day, I do not know why he decided to replace me. There's been a lot of speculation of various different reasons for it. But, it's possible that it could be as simple as the fact that, remember, we had an election that summer of 2021. We didn't gain any more seats. We went through an expensive election, but we ended up in the same place. And maybe at that point, the brain trust within the PMO decided with the Prime Minister, well, we didn't end up further ahead here. He was hoping for a majority, which is normal to hope for that. So maybe we need to do something to shake the tree a little bit. And there is a tendency to go towards shaking up the cabinet, in part for reasons that David pointed out, because the belief of interchangeability, which I have very strong views on, because I think the 5 years I spent in transport allowed me to really know that portfolio. I don't believe that you can know your portfolio very well unless you're there a minimum, if you're a super person, a minimum of a couple of years. You can become competent, but not super competent. So I think that there is value in keeping people in the same portfolios rather than thinking, oh, this will freshen everything up and Canadians will give us a new look. It doesn't happen very often.
So far, our relationship with China, Russia, the Americans, everybody, India has deteriorated, and I don't know where
it has been better.
Yes, to say the least.
People have pointed out, again, you hear this, I hear this a lot, people say Canada's position on the world stage has diminished. And you hear this all the time. Is that fair? Do you agree?
Very fair.
Yes, and I've written about that myself. I think that we have lost credibility for a couple of reasons. One is because we have said things on the world stage, but not been perceived as executing, following through with what our noble pronouncements. And the second thing is we're not carrying our weight in terms of our defense obligations, and that's been a long-standing problem for a very long time. And our close Western allies, particularly the United States, for them that is extremely serious. So I don't think that Canada is being listened to as much in the back rooms as it used to be because of those two factors.
And is Justin Trudeau, do you think, one of the main reasons? I mean, personally, has he lost, even before he announced his resignation, has he lost some of that standing on the world stage as well? Or is it just by virtue of Canadian policy, do you think?
I think some of the standing, there's a tarnish there's a shine that rubs off, I'll put it that way, over time. And again, he's been Prime Minister a long time. There's certainly one thing I would add to what Marc has said, and in agreement with what Marc has said, it's particularly important in foreign affairs to have continuity in the minister. And we've had too many ministers. That's not criticizing the quality of any one of them, especially not the one beside me. But we've just had too many. And it's hard for a Minister of Foreign Affairs to build relationships internationally, particularly with the American Secretary of State and others, over time, through thick and thin, you need to have both to build trust, and it's impossible if you keep shifting your ministers.
I heard former Trump aide John Bolton says that Trump thinks of Justin as a Twinkie, and like had very little respect for him. And I found that, well, probably not surprising coming out of the mouth of Trump, but I mean, when you think that a foreign leader, a prime minister, I mean, a country that produced his father and Jean Chrétien and a lot of great people, prime ministers, when we're referred to on a level like that, it says something.
Although I'd say it says something more about Trump.
Yeah, it does,
I mean,
but nonetheless, to come out publicly and say that makes you wonder.
Yeah, I'd rather not base anything of lasting value on Trump.
I agree.
But
Probably a wise decision.
But
yeah.
your point is well taken.
Do you think then, if just with respect to Trump, when Justin Trudeau went down to Mar-a-Lago, becoming the first of the G7 leaders to do it, my initial reaction was, good for you getting ahead of it. And a few days later, my reaction was, that was a mistake.
He's kowtowing,
So,
yeah.
what did you think about that when that happened?
I probably had a similar reaction to yours, Aaron, initially saying, good, he's grabbing the bull by the horns. But my sort of after feeling was that it looked like this was sort of set up almost in a way to make Trump look like I'm in charge and you're here begging for me to do something. I think that was the perception. Having said that, I think the Prime Minister did the right thing in going down there. You can't help and control how it's portrayed afterwards. If you are the Prime Minister and you are concerned, you should try to get in touch with the president, and even if it has to be done at Mar-a-Lago. And so I don't blame him for that.
Yeah, nor do I. I think we'd be criticizing him worse if he hadn't gone.
Yeah.
Okay. I would ask, too, if I could just get back. I know you have just the horse in the race in Marc Carney. One of the things that Chrystia Freeland is going to be saddled with, of course, is what Justin did when he resigned by saying how closely they've worked for the last 10 years. She was by his side. And obviously the opposition will have a field day with that and say she's no different than Justin is. So it would seem just from that perspective, Marc Carney would have an advantage. Do you think, is this a two-way race? Is this just Chrystia Freeland against Marc Carney? I know Karina Gould is going to announce as well. But, I mean, if you're looking at this and that's the two-way race, who do you think comes out ahead here?
Well,
Not who you want to come out ahead, who you think can come out ahead.
Well, I do think Marc will come out ahead. I do think it will end up being a two-way race. Again, I have a great deal of respect for Karina Gould. I have a great deal of respect for Chrystia Freeland. I have worked closely with both of them, actually. I was Christia's parliamentary secretary in my first year there in international trade. And so I think very highly of her skills. She's super smart and she's fundamentally kind and decent. That is a good thing. I think Marc will ultimately come out ahead. I'm going with my oldest friend, which I think is perfectly understandable. But I think Marc has a skill set, in particular through crises, 2008 and the financial crisis here in Canada, when he helped us avert the worst of what was happening in the United States. He's written about that in his book. But also just the ability to make difficult decisions. So I do think we come out ahead with Marc, and I think Marc comes out ahead in the race.
Okay.
I would say that I agree with everything David said about Karina Gould. She's really an up-and-comer and a very competent person, and everybody likes her. And this will be an opportunity for her perhaps to increase her profile for later on. I think ultimately it is between Carney and Freeland. They each bring different strengths to the game. Now, I ran in the leadership in 2013. Now, mind you, back then, it wasn't to become the Prime Minister. It was to be the leader of the third party, which Justin Trudeau won convincingly. But it taught me that the dynamics of a leadership contest are a little bit delicate because you are competing to be the one chosen. But you don't want to cross a certain line because you all hope to work together in a very constructive way afterwards. So you have to be a little bit careful. But at the same time, if it's perceived as a love-in by the public, they're saying, oh, you're all just sort of, you're not throwing any hardballs at each other. So it's a delicate balance that has to be done. And they are good friends. I gather that he is godfather to one of her children. So it's going to be very interesting to see how they present themselves, but also when they are asked to differentiate themselves, how they will be able to do that. I think they'll each just sort of try to speak to their strengths without criticizing the other.
We've all seen the Godfather movies, and we know what happens with Godfathers, that sometimes they can turn. But that notwithstanding, one thing we're overlooking, I think, is the Quebec Factor, because they say without a strong Franco voice in the party could be in trouble. And both of them are from out west, although it might help out west, but what do you say to that?
Both have learned to speak French, and I think both have shown themselves sensitive to Quebec, the nuances of Quebec politics, and the nuances of life in Quebec. And so I'm not worried. I think this is actually a good opportunity to showcase, and Karina's French is quite good too, so probably the best of all three. So this is a good opportunity to showcase the fact that people coming from other parts of the country have invested themselves in learning French and trying to understand Quebec. It would be great to have had a candidate from Quebec, particularly a Francophone Quebecer, but what we need to be is sensitive to various kinds of language issues, and I think I think this will be a good opportunity for non-Quebecers to show that they have that sensitivity.
Marc?
Well, I think back to Jack Layton now. Jack Layton did grow up in Quebec. He was in Hudson, but his French was at a certain level. But Quebecers fell in love with him for a whole bunch of reasons. So who knows? Maybe they'll fall in love with one of the two leaders. They're not from Quebec, but they may cut them some slack. We'll see.
You know, it's funny. I think at the beginning, when we started talking about the race, the big story every day was not who's in it, it's who's out of it. Yeah. Everybody who dropped out, one after another, starting with Dominic LeBlanc and all the way to François-Philippe Champagne. Was that surprising to you to see these high-profile cabinet members decide, this is not for me?
I would say in the case of Mélanie Joly and François-Philippe Champagne and Dominique Leblanc, the tug between wanting, because I think they would all have ambitions in that respect, but the fact that they are crucial players in the negotiations with the Americans, that I think was a determining factor. The other factor is, when I ran in 2013, you had to raise $75,000. This time it's $350,000, and you've only got weeks to do it. It's very, very demanding to raise that much money, even if it's only 10 years later. It's a tall order, and I think one of the things you do is you gauge whether that kind of money will come in maximum pieces of, 1800?
1750.
1750. It's a tall order, and so you have to have a certain sort of stature, I think, to be in that kind of league.
David, were you surprised by them dropping out at the outset?
Not at all. In part for the reasons that Marc outlined, in part because of the $350,000 deposit, or the deposit's less than that, but the $350,000 payment. And in part, I think there is an appreciation of already there would be an appreciation of who the front runners will eventually be, and you've got to measure yourself up against that. And at that point, it's, can I fundraise? Can I organize? Can I raise that amount of money that quickly, and yet still be not one of the two front runners? And so it's
neither of you were interested in tossing your hat into the ring.
I can speak for myself, and I would say no, but I can't speak for Marc.
Well, I'll refer to that analogy of there's not a snowball's chance in hell that I was going to run
So I can
against.
safely say neither one of you will very soon announce that you're running for leadership. I do have one other question, which is this. There was a lot made of the fact that given the polling numbers and that they're so bad for the Liberals, it seems to be getting worse, not better. Why would you want to put yourself in a race that you're likely to lose in the next election? So you get to be, Liberal Party leader and Prime Minister for a week. Then there's an election, you lose. Now you have to spend the next 4 years in opposition. I can't imagine that's something Chrystia Freeland would want to do, given the fact that she's held the position she has. I even think for Marc Carney, do you think that's something he would want to do?
I think so. Look, there is. Look, I'm a policy geek, so I would love to be able to be involved. From the beginning, forming policy for a party that needs to reset. Like that would be a fantastic opportunity. And so I can see others. Marc has a policy bent as well, and I think Christia does too. So I can see that they would be interested in that kind of long-term rebuilding. You're building it in your own image, which is an interesting thing.
But there might not even be an opposition. There's talk of the Bloc Québécois being the official opposition.
Well, that's true. I mean, when Marc ran for the leadership, you were running as leader of the third party. So, look, there's dedication there. Marc has demonstrated it, and I think all the candidates currently, we have 1.5 thus far. Christia's had a soft launch today. But assuming Christia and Karina jump in, we've got 3 people who are committed to a rebuild, and I think that's a positive thing.
Marc, same?
Yeah, no, I think it does not surprise me. I think that they are truly committed, even if it does not mean being the Prime Minister of Canada. There's a lot of value in being in opposition. Particularly for somebody who has not been elected before. I found the 7 years I was in opposition initially were very formative in many ways, and you didn't suddenly, fall off the end of the pier when you were elected to your surprise. So, no, I think they are committed. They're committed to the values of the Liberal Party, which I think is good. They're mostly committed to their country. And so I think we should tip our hats to them. They're ready to do this knowing that it's to some extent a high-risk strategy.
We have to wrap up. I did want to go back to what Bill talked about in terms of someone from Quebec. I took note of the fact that in the tweet today from Chrystia Freeland about announcing, she's going to be announcing in Montreal. And I thought, that's interesting. Marc Carney announced in Edmonton. She's announcing here because clearly you have to be thinking that you need Quebec. That's obviously by design.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that each will make their announcements strategically, depending on the narrative that they want to get out. You can see that for someone like Marc Carney, it's important that he show his Western roots. Born in the Northwest Territories, grew up in Edmonton. Christie doesn't have to do that. She's been in politics now for 10 years. And a cabinet minister for most of it. So she doesn't need to do
she
that.
wouldn't announce in Toronto or somewhere in Ontario, like in her own riding?
No, she doesn't need to do that. They
Go
know
on
her-
to
they
Jon
know her
Stewart
there.
on Comedy Central.
That's it.
Which I found kind of
That's it.
interesting and unique.
That's right.
I would ask one last thing, if you'll just allow me. You both saw Justin on CNN with Jake Tapper.
Yeah.
I didn't actually.
Okay, but you heard what he said when asked about how do you define a Canadian? And in trying to explain the answer, said the easiest way perhaps would be to say, we're not American. And he took a little bit of guff for that. I thought it was a great answer personally, but yeah, a lot of people looked at him and said, why would that be the first thing you'd say as to how to define a Canadian? Did we read anything into that? You saw it, Marc.
Yeah, no, that's a question one should expect from the media. And, I know they wrote their op pieces, but I thought both Chrétien and John Manley wrote some very good explanations of what a Canadian is and why we're different from Americans. But, when you're on TV, you've only got that sort of short soundbite, so it's not easy.
Okay.
Remember Peter Zosky way back for the CBC said, as Canadian as possible under the circumstances was his definition of Canadian.
All right, and that's where we will leave it. I want to thank you both, Marc Garneau, David Lametti. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Looking forward to the election.
Thank you.
That wraps up another edition of the Corner Booth Podcast here from the Snowden Deli. We'll see you again soon.